We're surrounded. Ethan Cole's voice tore across the valley as another burst of gunfire hammered the burned-out armored vehicle beside him. Metal screamed. Sparks sprayed across the rocks. 6 Navy SEALs were trapped behind the wreckage, pinned inside a narrow Afghan valley with nowhere left to move. Enemy fighters held the eastern ridge, the western slope, and the dry riverbed behind them. Every escape route had become a firing lane. Ethan pressed his back against the twisted steel and checked his magazine. 7 rounds. Across from him, Blake Turner dragged a wounded teammate deeper into cover. Blood darkened the medic's sleeve, but his hands stayed locked around his rifle. Movement behind us. Blake shouted. Ethan looked over the broken axle. 5 armed men were descending through the rocks, using the smoke as cover. Above them, a machine gunner shifted his weapon toward the SEAL's position. The team's radio operator slapped the side of his damaged handset. Raven Base, this is Viper 1. We are surrounded and taking heavy fire. Request immediate air support. Only static answered. The nearest rescue aircraft was still miles away. They would not arrive in time. A round punched through the vehicle's door inches from Ethan's face. He ducked as fragments of steel cut across his cheek. 30 seconds. Blake yelled. Maybe less. Ethan raised his rifle and fired twice toward the western ridge. 1 fighter dropped behind the rocks, but 3 more moved into his place. The enemy knew the SEALs were running out of ammunition. They were closing the circle. Then Ethan saw the man with the grenade launcher. He stood on a narrow ledge nearly 800 meters away, protected by 2 riflemen. He lowered the launcher toward the wreckage and adjusted his stance. Ethan understood immediately. 1 grenade would finish them. Launcher on the ridge, he shouted. Blake turned, found the target, and lifted his rifle. Too far. Too much smoke. No clear shot. The enemy fighter placed his finger on the trigger. Then the mountain spoke. A single rifle crack rolled across the valley. The grenade launcher flew from the man's hands. His body folded backward and disappeared behind the ledge. For half a second, the entire battlefield seemed to stop. Blake stared at the ridge. That wasn't us. A second shot echoed from somewhere high above the valley. The machine gunner on the eastern slope collapsed over his weapon. A third shot followed. One of the fighters approaching from behind spun and fell between the rocks. 3 shots. 3 threats gone. Ethan looked toward the distant mountain, searching for movement among the gray cliffs. He saw nothing. No muzzle flash. No silhouette. No sign that anyone could be lying up there. Only snow, stone, and a thin line of shadow near the summit. Who the hell is shooting? Blake whispered. Ethan touched his radio. Unknown sniper. Identify yourself. Static. No answer. Another bullet crossed more than 2 kilometers of open air and struck the enemy commander as he raised his hand to order the final assault. The fighters below hesitated. That hesitation was all Ethan needed. Viper team, prepare to move. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in courage and respect, hit like and subscribe. These stories inspire change. And we're glad you're here. Now, back to Claire Dawson. 6 hours earlier, Claire had been sitting alone at the edge of Raven Base, cleaning dust from an old sniper rifle that everyone else believed belonged in a museum. She worked beneath the weak morning sun, her movements slow and exact. Each component rested on a folded cloth beside her, arranged in perfect order. The rifle's wooden finish was scratched. Its scope carried faded marks from years of use. Nothing about it looked modern. Nothing about Claire looked dangerous either. She was small, quiet, and dressed like an ordinary reconnaissance specialist. Her dark hair was pulled into a tight regulation bun, and a weathered notebook rested beside her ammunition case. A group of SEALs crossed the yard behind her. Blake Turner noticed the rifle first. He slowed, exchanged a look with the others, and smiled. Careful with that antique, he called. It might fall apart before you reach the mountain. Claire did not look up. She slid the bolt into place and listened to the soft click of steel locking against steel. Blake stepped closer. You actually planning to use that thing? Claire finally raised her eyes. Beyond him, the mountain stood silent beneath the pale sky. Yes, she said. Blake laughed. Claire looked back down at the rifle. By sunset, none of them would be laughing. The morning at Raven Base began with rotor wash, diesel fumes, and the metallic clatter of weapons being prepared for war. Claire Dawson sat alone beneath a canvas awning near the edge of the motor pool. Her rifle lay across a maintenance table in front of her. It was an older platform, rebuilt so many times that little remained of its original configuration. The stock was worn smooth near the grip. The scope carried tiny scratches along its housing. A strip of faded cloth had been tied around the barrel to break its outline against stone. To Blake Turner, it looked outdated. To Claire, it looked familiar. She ran a clean cloth along the bolt, checked the firing pin, then turned the scope adjustment one click to the left. Around her, the base was waking. Ground crews moved between helicopters. Mechanics shouted over idling engines. Soldiers carried ammunition boxes toward the staging area. Somewhere near the command tent, an officer was arguing about satellite coverage. Claire ignored all of it. Her attention remained on the mountains. They rose beyond the outer wall in layers of gray and brown, cut by narrow passes and deep shadows. From the base, they looked empty. Claire knew better. Mountains never looked dangerous from a distance. That was how they survived. Blake approached with two other SEALs behind him. Petty Officer Mason Reed carried a machine gun across his chest. Daniel Ruiz, the team medic, was checking straps on his aid bag. Blake stopped beside Claire's table. "You really brought that thing for today's operation?" Claire continued inspecting the rifle. "It was assigned to me." "By who? A museum curator?" Mason laughed under his breath. Daniel did not. He studied Claire for a moment, then looked at the rifle. "You modified the trigger assembly," he said. Claire glanced at him. "Yes." "And the optic mount?" "Yes." Blake leaned against the table. "Does it actually fire, or is it just supposed to scare people?" Claire placed the bolt back into the receiver. The action closed with a clean, heavy click. "It fires." Blake waited for more. Claire gave him nothing. That seemed to irritate him. He had been with Ethan Cole's team for almost 3 years. He was fast, aggressive, and reliable under pressure. But he carried the confidence of someone who had survived enough firefights to believe his instincts were always correct. Claire had seen men like him before. Some learned. Some did not. "You're the terrain specialist, right?" Blake asked. "The one intelligence sent over?" "Reconnaissance support. That means you watch from a hill and tell us which direction the wind is blowing." Claire folded the cloth beside the rifle. "It means I see what you miss." Mason's smile disappeared. Blake straightened. For the first time, the humor left his face. Before he could answer, Ethan Cole stepped out of the command tent. "Briefing. Now." The team moved toward him. Claire lifted the rifle and followed. Inside the operations tent, a satellite image covered the central screen. It showed a narrow valley surrounded by steep ridgelines. A cluster of stone buildings sat near the northern end. Ethan pointed to the map. "Target is Hamid Kassari, regional commander, responsible for 3 attacks on coalition patrols in the last month." He traced a route through the valley. "We enter from the south, secure the compound, confirm identity, and extract before dark." Claire studied the screen. Her eyes moved from the road to the ridges, then to 3 barely visible lines crossing the eastern slope. "Those trails are active," she said. The room quieted. The intelligence officer frowned. "We saw no movement there. You were looking for vehicles. We had drone coverage for 6 hours." Claire stepped closer to the image. "These shadows are new. So are the disturbed rocks here and here." She pointed to 2 narrow positions overlooking the road. "They're building firing points." Blake crossed his arms. "Or goats walk through." Claire looked at him. "Goats don't build overlapping fields of fire." Ethan studied the screen again. "How many fighters?" "I can't tell. Enough to compromise the route." Claire's answer came without hesitation. "Yes." The intelligence officer shook his head. "We delay based on this. We lose the target." Claire turned toward the western ridge, then changed the route. Blake gave a quiet laugh. "We came here to capture 1 man, not redesign the operation because someone saw footprints on a screen." Claire looked at Ethan. "Put me on the northern peak." "That's over 2 kilometers from the compound," Ethan said. "I know. You'll be alone." "I know that too." Ethan watched her for several seconds. Then he nodded. "You deploy first." Blake looked toward Mason and smiled. Claire picked up her rifle case. As she passed him, Blake spoke softly. "Try not to get lost up there." Claire stopped. She looked once toward the mountains, then back at him. "You should worry about the valley." She walked out of the tent. Behind her, no one spoke. By noon, the SEAL team would enter that valley, and every warning Claire had given them would begin to come true. By 09:30, Claire Dawson was already halfway up the northern ridge. The climb was steeper than the satellite images suggested. Loose shale shifted beneath her boots. Dry wind pushed dust across the slope in thin gray sheets. Every few minutes, she stopped beneath the shadow of a rock shelf and listened. No engines, no voices, no birds. That last detail bothered her most. She adjusted the rifle case across her back and continued upward. Below, Raven Base had disappeared behind the folds of the terrain. The only sign of human presence was the faint trail left by the SEAL convoy, moving toward the valley from the south. Claire raised a compact rangefinder and watched the vehicles through the heat haze. 6 operators, 1 armored truck, 1 light transport vehicle. Exactly as planned. 2 exactly. She lowered the rangefinder and looked toward the eastern slope. Something flashed between 2 rocks. Not sunlight. Glass. Claire dropped into a crouch. She waited. 3 seconds later, the flash appeared again, farther north this time. Someone was using binoculars. Someone was watching the convoy. Claire reached for her radio. Viper 1, this is Overwatch. Possible observer on the eastern ridge. Grid follows. Static cracked in her earpiece. Then Ethan's voice came through. Copy, Overwatch. We have no visual. Hold your route. A pause. Repeat. Hold your route. You're being watched. Blake's voice cut into the channel. We're still 4 kilometers from the target. Could be a shepherd. Claire kept her eyes on the ridge. Then he's the first shepherd I've seen using military optics. Silence followed. Ethan answered. Continue observation. We'll reduce speed. It was not the response Claire wanted, but it was better than nothing. She moved higher. Near the summit, the terrain flattened into a narrow shelf overlooking the entire valley. From there, she could see the stone compound, the dry riverbed, and the southern road the SEALs would use for extraction. She also saw the first clear sign of the trap. A section of road had been disturbed. The dirt was darker there, packed unevenly across a strip wide enough to hide a pressure plate or buried charge. Claire shifted her scope toward the surrounding rocks. 2 men lay beneath camouflage netting near the eastern ridge. Another waited behind a low wall with a handheld radio. Farther north, 3 figures moved between caves carrying ammunition boxes. This was not a security detail. It was an ambush force. Claire pressed the transmit switch. Viper 1, abort approach. Ethan answered immediately. Give me a reason. Multiple fighting positions. At least 6 confirmed. Possible explosive device on the southern route. The convoy slowed below. Claire saw the lead vehicle hesitate near a bend. Then Blake spoke. We've got no indication on thermal. No movement from the compound. They're cold positioned. Were you seeing rocks? Claire's jaw tightened. She shifted the rifle from her shoulder and began assembling it behind cover. The old weapon came together without wasted movement. Bolt, optic, suppressor, bipod, magazine. Each piece locked into place with the certainty of ritual. Through the scope, Claire watched the man with the radio lift 2 fingers. A signal. On the road below, Ethan's vehicle continued forward. Claire keyed the radio again. Ethan stopped the convoy. This time, she used his name. The channel went quiet. He understood what that meant. Before Ethan could respond, the lead vehicle rolled over the darkened section of road. Nothing happened. Blake's voice returned, carrying a thin edge of satisfaction. Road is clear. Claire did not answer. She was looking beyond the vehicle. The disturbed earth had never been meant for the lead truck. It was a marker, a reference point. She moved the scope toward the western ridge and found a man hidden behind a firing device, his hand resting beside a cable that disappeared into the rocks. The real charge was farther ahead, exactly where the second vehicle would be when the team entered the narrowest part of the valley. Claire's fingers settled near the trigger. She could take the man now, but if she fired, the ambush force would know they had been detected. If she waited, the SEALs might drive directly into the kill zone. Below, the convoy kept moving. Claire measured the distance. 2,140 meters. Strong crosswind. Downward angle. 1 shot. No margin for error. She exhaled slowly. Then the man behind the firing device turned his head. He was not watching the convoy. He was looking directly toward Claire's mountain. Someone had already found her. Claire held perfectly still. Through the scope, the man on the western ridge stared toward her position. He wore a faded brown jacket and carried an old military radio against his chest. Then he raised one hand. 2 fighters emerged from behind the rocks below him. Both began climbing toward Claire. She shifted her rifle slightly and studied their route. 400 meters below, moving fast, using the dead ground between the ridges. They would reach her position in less than 10 minutes. Claire keyed her radio. Viper 1, my position is compromised. Ethan's voice answered through a wall of static. Can you relocate? Not without losing coverage. Then relocate. We'll handle the valley. Claire watched the second vehicle approach the narrow section of road. No, you won't. Blake cut into the channel. We're almost at the compound. Stop trying to turn this into your mission. Claire ignored him. The man beside the firing device leaned forward. His thumb moved toward the switch. Claire calculated the distance again. 2,140 meters. Wind from the northwest. 9 miles per hour, shifting. The shot would take nearly 3 seconds to reach him. She adjusted one click. Then another. Her breathing slowed. The mountain disappeared. The radio disappeared. Only the target remained. Claire squeezed the trigger. The rifle struck her shoulder with a deep, controlled force. Far across the valley, the man beside the firing device snapped backward. His hand missed the switch as he collapsed behind the rocks. The sound reached the convoy seconds later. Blake looked up from the passenger seat. What was that? Claire was already moving. She grabbed the rifle, slid behind a higher stone shelf, and chambered another round. The two fighters climbing toward her dropped behind cover. They had heard the shot. They knew exactly where she was. Below, the SEAL convoy stopped. Ethan stepped from the lead vehicle and raised his binoculars toward the western ridge. He spotted the fallen man. Then he saw the cable. Everyone out, he shouted. Move. The team spilled from the vehicles and spread toward the rocks. Blake jumped down last. What happened? That man had a detonator. Blake stared toward the ridge. Claire's voice came through the radio. Your second vehicle is sitting 20 meters from the charge. The words had barely left her mouth when automatic fire erupted from the eastern slope. Rounds struck the lead truck, shattering a side window and tearing through the hood. Contact east, Mason yelled. The valley exploded into motion. SEALs dove behind rocks and returned fire. More fighters appeared along the ridgeline, rising from positions hidden beneath dust-colored netting. There were not 6. There were at least 20. Ethan dropped beside a boulder and fired toward a muzzle flash. Overwatch, confirm enemy strength. Claire tracked movement through her scope. 22 visible. More inside the caves. Blake pressed himself against the ground as bullets cut across the road. For the first time that morning, he had nothing to say. Claire searched for the enemy radio operator. She found him kneeling behind a wall, shouting into his handset. Her second shot struck the radio from his hand. Her third forced a machine gunner away from his weapon. The SEALs moved toward higher cover. For several seconds, the pressure eased. Then Claire heard the scrape of stone behind her. One of the climbers had reached the ridge. She rolled as a burst of gunfire ripped through the place where her head had been. Fragments of rock struck her face. Claire came up on one knee and fired once. The fighter fell backward. The second man appeared from her left. Too close for the rifle. Claire released the weapon, stepped inside his reach, and drove her shoulder into his chest. His rifle discharged into the sky. She trapped his arm, turned sharply, and sent him over the edge of the stone shelf. He disappeared down the slope. Claire recovered her rifle and crawled back to the firing position. Below, Ethan's team had reached the dry riverbed. For one brief moment, it looked as if they might escape. Then Claire saw movement behind them. Dozens of fighters were emerging from the southern pass, sealing the route back to Raven Base. At the same time, more men appeared on the western ridge. The trap was larger than she had imagined. Claire raised the radio. Viper 1, enemy forces are closing from the south. Ethan looked over the riverbank. He saw them. His face changed. How many? Claire watched the valley tighten around the 6 men. Too many. A rocket struck the lead vehicle. Fire rolled across the road, and black smoke climbed between the cliffs. The blast killed their radio signal. Claire heard only static. Far below, Ethan pulled his wounded operator behind the burning wreckage. Blake turned in a full circle, staring at the armed men appearing on every ridge. Then Ethan shouted the words Claire had known were coming. We're surrounded. We're surrounded. Ethan's shout vanished beneath the roar of gunfire. Enemy rounds struck the burned vehicle from 3 directions, punching through its outer panels and scattering sparks across the dry riverbed. Black smoke rolled over the SEALs, blinding them for seconds at a time. Mason Reed dropped beside Ethan and replaced the ammunition belt on his machine gun. West Ridge is moving. I see them. Ethan raised his rifle and fired 3 controlled shots through the smoke. One fighter fell behind a rock. The others kept advancing. They knew the SEALs were trapped. Blake crouched behind the wreckage with Daniel Ruiz. The medic had been hit high in the shoulder, and blood ran beneath the straps of his vest. I can still move, Daniel said. You can barely lift your arm. I said I can move. Blake tightened the field dressing and looked over the edge of the vehicle. More fighters were coming through the southern pass. Not running. Walking. They had time. That was worse. The enemy commander knew the valley belonged to him now. Above them, Claire lay behind her rifle and watched the circle close. The radio was dead. The explosion had severed the team's main antenna, and her own handset had taken damage during the fight on the ridge. She could hear fragments of voices, but nothing clear enough to answer. She checked the distance to Ethan's position. 2,300 meters. The wind had strengthened. Heat rising from the burning truck distorted the air above the riverbed. Each target blurred at the edges, then sharpened again. Claire adjusted the scope. The first threat was a machine gunner on the eastern slope. He was moving his weapon onto a higher rock shelf, where he would have a clear angle behind the wreckage. Claire inhaled, held, fired. The rifle cracked across the mountain. The machine gunner dropped before he could lock the weapon into place. Blake looked toward the ridge. There she is. Ethan did not answer. He had seen a second threat. A man carrying a rocket launcher climbed onto a ledge above the southern pass. He knelt, braced the tube against his shoulder, and aimed toward the riverbed. Rocket! Ethan shouted. Mason turned his machine gun, but the angle was too steep. Claire found the launcher through her scope. 2,400 meters. Quartering wind. Target partially obscured. She moved the crosshairs above his shoulder. The man leaned forward. Claire fired. The bullet crossed the valley in silence before striking the launcher's side assembly. The weapon twisted sideways just as the man pulled the trigger. The rocket streaked into the western ridge and exploded among the fighters advancing there. Stone and dust erupted into the air. For the first time, the enemy line broke. Move! Ethan shouted. The SEALs left the wreckage and ran toward a cluster of boulders near the northern side of the riverbed. Mason fired while moving. Blake supported Daniel with one arm and kept his rifle raised with the other. Rounds cut into the dirt around their boots. Claire fired again. A rifleman fell. Then another. She was not shooting at the closest targets. She was removing the men directing the attack. The radio operator. The machine gun assistant. The fighters signaling from the western ridge. Each shot created confusion. Each second gave the SEALs more ground. Ethan reached the boulders first and turned to cover the others. Mason arrived next. Then Blake. Daniel stumbled 3 steps from safety. A round struck the ground beside him, and he collapsed. Blake turned back. Daniel. Ethan grabbed his vest. Leave him. We cover and recover. I'm not leaving him. Blake pulled free and ran into the open. 3 enemy rifles shifted toward him. Claire saw all of them. The first stood behind a low wall. She fired. He dropped. The second appeared between 2 rocks. She cycled the bolt and fired again. He vanished backward. The third was farther south, already squeezing the trigger. Claire moved the scope. The image shook. Not from wind. Her left hand was bleeding. A piece of stone from the earlier gunfire had cut deep across her palm, and blood was running beneath the rifle stock. She ignored it. The third fighter fired. His round passed behind Blake's neck. Claire answered. Her bullet struck him before he could fire again. Blake reached Daniel, dragged him by the vest, and pulled him behind the boulders. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then Mason looked toward the distant peak. She just cleared that entire run. Ethan checked his ammunition. The respect in his face was unmistakable now, but Claire could not see it. She was watching a new group appear above the eastern ridge. Among them was a tall man carrying a long rifle with a large optic. Not another rifleman. A sniper. He dropped into position and turned his scope toward Claire's mountain. She shifted behind cover as a bullet struck the rock beside her head. The enemy had finally understood what was keeping the SEALs alive, and now they were coming for her. The enemy sniper fired again. The bullet struck the ridge 6 inches above Claire's shoulder, breaking a fist-sized piece of stone from the cliff. She rolled behind cover as fragments cut across her cheek. For the first time since the ambush began, she could no longer see the valley. That was exactly what the sniper wanted. He did not need to kill her immediately. He only needed to keep her head down long enough for the fighters below to finish the SEAL team. Claire pressed her back against the rock and listened. The distant rifle report arrived almost 4 seconds after the impact. Long range. Heavy caliber. The shooter was positioned somewhere along the eastern ridge, nearly level with her elevation. She closed her eyes and replayed the angle of the strike. Slightly downward. Wind from right to left. The sniper was not at the main firing position she had seen earlier. He had relocated. Below, Ethan studied the ridges through a cracked pair of binoculars. Overwatch has stopped firing, Mason said. Blake looked toward Claire's mountain. She's pinned. Another wave of enemy fighters moved through the dry riverbed. Ethan counted at least 12. Their ammunition was almost gone. Mason had half a belt remaining. Blake had 1 full magazine. Ethan had 9 rifle rounds and a pistol he hoped he would not need. Daniel sat against the boulder, pale but conscious, one hand pressed over his bandaged shoulder. You need to leave me, he said. No, Ethan replied. You carry me. They catch all of you. No one gets left. The answer came without hesitation. Daniel looked down and said nothing more. A burst of machine gun fire struck the boulders, forcing the team lower. Blake slammed a fresh magazine into his rifle. She warned us. Ethan turned toward him. Blake's eyes stayed on the valley. At the briefing, she saw all of this, and I laughed at her. Ethan raised his weapon. Regret it later. The fighters entered the riverbed. Contact front. The SEALs opened fire. Mason's machine gun hammered across the rocks. Ethan dropped one attacker near the burned vehicle. Blake fired at another moving through the smoke. But there were too many. Every man they stopped was replaced by 2 more. High above, Claire removed the damaged radio from her vest and placed it beside the rifle. She tore a strip of cloth from her sleeve, wrapped it tightly around her bleeding palm, and studied the terrain behind her. There was another firing position 20 meters higher. Reaching it meant crossing open ground. The enemy sniper would be waiting for exactly that. Claire picked up a small observation mirror and held it just beyond the edge of the rock. A shot shattered it instantly. She had the angle now. Eastern ridge, near a split stone formation shaped like 2 leaning pillars. Claire remembered seeing it during her climb. Distance, 2,600 meters. The wind between the peaks would be unpredictable. A direct shot from her current position would be nearly impossible, so she did not attempt one. Instead, she removed her jacket and pushed it beneath a spare cloth. She placed the shape near the southern edge of her cover, leaving just enough fabric visible to resemble a shoulder. Then she crawled in the opposite direction. The sniper fired. The decoy jumped as the bullet tore through it. Claire rose from behind another rock, found the muzzle flash, and fired before the echo reached her. Across the valley, the enemy sniper recoiled. Claire's bullet struck the stone beside his scope, spraying fragments into his face. He pulled back, blinded and disoriented. Not a kill. She did not need one. She needed 3 seconds. Claire grabbed her rifle and sprinted uphill. 1. Her boots slid across loose shale. 2. Another enemy shot passed behind her. 3. She dropped behind the higher shelf, unfolded the bipod, and found the riverbed through her scope. The SEALs were almost overrun. A fighter had reached the outer boulder and was raising his weapon toward Ethan's. Back. Claire fired. He fell before Ethan ever saw him. She cycled the bolt. A second fighter rushed Blake from the smoke. Claire fired again. Blake flinched as the man collapsed at his feet. Then came a third shot. A fourth. A fifth. From the riverbed, it sounded as if the mountain itself had opened fire. The enemy advance stopped. Men who had charged forward with confidence suddenly searched the ridges in panic. Ethan recognized the opening. North Passage, he shouted. Move now. Mason lifted Daniel onto his back. Blake covered the rear. The team broke from the boulders and pushed toward a narrow cut in the cliff. Claire continued firing above them, turning every exposed enemy position into a place no one wanted to stand. Then she saw the commander. He stood near the southern pass, shouting orders and pointing toward the SEAL's escape route. Claire centered the crosshairs on his chest. Before she fired, movement flashed at the edge of her scope. The wounded sniper had recovered. His rifle was aimed directly at her. For 1 suspended second, both shooters held the other in their sights. Claire knew she could kill the commander. She also knew the sniper would kill her immediately afterward. Below, Ethan's team was still 20 meters from safety. Claire moved her finger onto the trigger and chose the team. Claire shifted the crosshairs away from the commander. The enemy sniper fired first. His bullet struck the edge of her position and tore through the upper part of her sleeve. The impact spun her sideways, but she kept one hand locked around the rifle. Below, Ethan's team was still exposed. 20 meters. Then 15. Mason carried Daniel across his shoulders while Blake moved backward, firing short bursts toward the riverbed. Claire forced herself upright. The sniper was already chambering another round. She found him through the scope. Not his chest. Not his head. His rifle. Claire fired. The bullet struck the enemy weapon near the receiver. Metal shattered. The scope tore loose and spun across the rocks. The sniper dropped behind cover, clutching his face. Claire turned back toward the valley. The commander was gone. He had moved. A line of fighters began, climbing the northern slope, trying to cut off the SEALs before they reached the passage. Claire tracked the first man. Fired. He fell across the trail. The second tried to move around him. Another shot. He dropped behind a narrow ledge. The remaining fighters scattered, but Claire knew they would recover quickly. She could feel blood running down her arm beneath the torn sleeve. Her left hand had begun to shake. She pressed the rifle harder into her shoulder. Below, Ethan reached the entrance to the northern passage. Inside, he shouted. Mason carried Daniel between the stone walls. Blake followed, then turned back. Ethan was still outside. The team leader had stopped to fire at a group advancing through the smoke. Ethan, Blake yelled. Move. A fighter appeared above the passage with a rifle aimed down toward him. Claire saw the angle. Almost no target. Only part of a shoulder and half a face visible between two rocks. Distance, 2,500 meters. Wind shifting again. She slowed her breathing. The fighter leaned farther forward. Claire fired. The man disappeared. Ethan ran into the passage as bullets struck the ground behind him. For the first time since the ambush began, all 6 SEALs were out of the open. But they were not safe. The passage narrowed ahead, twisting between walls of black stone. It offered protection from the ridges, but only one route forward. And somewhere beyond it, Claire could see movement. Another enemy group was entering from the northern side. The SEALs were being driven into a second trap. Claire reached for the radio. Viper 1, stop. Only static answered. She tried again. Ethan, the north exit is compromised. Nothing. The damaged handset was finished. Claire looked at the distance between her position and the passage. Too far to warn them by voice. Too far to reach them before the enemy did. She opened the weathered notebook beside her rifle. Inside were hand-drawn maps of the valley, wind tables, range calculations, and escape routes she had marked before sunrise. There was another way out. A narrow climbing trail ran west from the passage, almost invisible from below. It crossed beneath a rock arch and descended into a dry gorge beyond the enemy line. But Ethan did not know it existed. Claire removed a small signaling mirror from her vest. Broken. She checked her remaining equipment. 1 green flare. The team had been briefed that green meant extraction route clear. It was not meant for this, but it was all she had. Claire loaded the flare launcher and aimed toward the western rock arch. She fired. A bright green light climbed above the valley, curved through the smoke, and dropped behind the passage. Inside the ravine, Blake saw the glow reflect against the stone wall. What is that? Ethan stopped. He looked toward the western side of the passage and saw a narrow crack between the rocks. Then he understood. She's showing us another route. Mason adjusted Daniel's weight. Can we trust it? Ethan looked back toward the mountain. More than we trusted ourselves. They turned west. Above them, Claire watched the team disappear beneath the rock arch. Then she heard loose stone shift behind her. The enemy sniper stood 10 meters away. His damaged rifle was gone. A pistol rested in his hand. Blood covered one side of his face. You chose them, he said. Claire slowly released the rifle. Yes. He raised the pistol. Claire looked past him toward the valley, where the last of the SEALs had vanished into safety. Then she met his eyes. That was your mistake, the sniper said. Claire's expression did not change. No, she replied. It was yours. The enemy sniper's pistol remained fixed on Claire's chest. Wind moved across the ridge, carrying smoke from the valley below. Somewhere beyond the cliffs, gunfire continued in short, fading bursts. Claire stood slowly. Her rifle lay on the ground between them. The sniper smiled. You saved them, he said. But no one is coming for you. Claire looked at his stance. Right foot forward. Weight too high. Injured vision on the left side. His pistol hand was steady, but his breathing was not. You should have stayed behind your scope, she said. His smile disappeared. He stepped closer. Claire moved. Her left hand knocked the pistol outward as his finger tightened on the trigger. The shot cracked into the sky. She drove her elbow into his wrist, trapped his arm, and turned beneath it. The sniper tried to pull away, but his balance was already gone. Claire struck his knee. He fell. The pistol slid across the rocks. He reached for a knife at his belt. Claire kicked his hand aside and drove him flat against the ground. For 1 second, both of them were still. Then he twisted sharply and threw his shoulder into her injured arm. Pain flashed across Claire's body. Her grip broke. The sniper rolled toward the pistol. Claire grabbed the sling of her rifle, pulled the weapon across the ground, and swung the stock into his forearm before he could reach it. The pistol dropped over the edge of the ridge. The sniper stared after it. Claire rose behind him. Your second mistake, she said, breathing hard, was getting close. He turned. Claire struck once. The man collapsed beside the broken rifle he had carried up the mountain. She stood over him for a moment, listening for movement. Nothing. Claire picked up her weapon and returned to the overlook. Through the scope, she found the western gorge. The SEAL team was moving through it. Slowly. Mason still carried Daniel. Ethan led from the front. Blake covered the rear. The alternate route had taken them beyond the main enemy line, but the fighting was not finished. 3 armed men were moving above the gorge, trying to intercept them before they reached the extraction point. Claire settled behind the rifle again. Her wounded hand barely closed around the stock. She forced it into place. The first fighter appeared above Ethan. Claire fired. He dropped behind the ridge. The second turned toward the sound. She fired again. The shot struck the rock beside him, forcing him back long enough for Blake to cross the open ground. The third man disappeared into a narrow cut. Claire searched for movement. Nothing. Then Ethan's voice broke through her damaged radio. Weak. Distorted. Overwatch. This is Viper 1. Claire looked down at the handset. Viper 1, I read you. A pause followed. For the first time that day, Ethan sounded relieved. We're approaching the extraction point. 3 hostiles above your west side. 2 are down. 1 is still moving. Copy. Claire watched the gorge. The final fighter emerged behind Blake, close enough that the sniper rifle was almost unnecessary. Blake did not see him. Claire adjusted for the angle. Her vision blurred for a moment. Blood loss. Fatigue. Wind. She blinked once and steadied the crosshairs. The fighter raised his weapon. Claire fired. He fell at Blake's feet. Blake spun around, staring at the body. Then he looked toward the distant mountain. Even from more than 2 kilometers away, Claire could see the change in his posture. No arrogance. No laughter. Only understanding. The rescue helicopter appeared beyond the gorge seconds later. Its rotors cut through the smoke as it descended toward the extraction point. Ethan moved the team into position. Mason lowered Daniel onto the ground. Blake knelt beside him. The helicopter touched down. Dust exploded across the rocks. One by one, the SEALs climbed aboard. Ethan remained outside. He looked toward Claire's mountain and raised his radio. Overwatch, we're secure. Claire watched him through the scope. Copy. Send your coordinates. We'll come for you. Claire glanced at the enemy sniper lying unconscious nearby, then at the blood soaking her sleeve. Negative. Airspace is still exposed. That wasn't a request. Claire almost smiled. Before she could answer, another voice entered the channel. Older. Calm. Authoritative. Viper 1, this is Raven Actual. Hold extraction. A second helicopter appeared from the north. Black. Unmarked. It flew low between the ridges and climbed directly toward Claire's position. Blake heard the call and looked at Ethan. Who sent that aircraft? Ethan did not answer. He was staring at the helicopter's markings. There were none. The black aircraft hovered above the ridge as 2 operators descended on ropes. The first man reached the ground, turned toward Claire, and immediately saluted. Blake watched through Ethan's binoculars. His face went still. The second operator approached Claire and spoke over the radio. Mountain Ghost, command sends its regards. Ethan lowered the binoculars. Years earlier, during advanced sniper training, he had heard stories about a classified operator who could control an entire battlefield from beyond visual range. No photograph. No official record. Only a name whispered between instructors. Mountain Ghost. He looked toward the woman they had mocked beside the maintenance table that morning, and finally understood who had been watching over them. The black helicopter carried Claire Dawson back to Raven Base just after sunset. By then, the valley had disappeared beneath darkness. The wounded were taken directly to the medical station. Daniel Ruiz was rushed inside with Ethan beside him, while Mason followed carrying the team's damaged radio and the last of their ammunition. Blake remained on the landing pad. He watched Claire step from the unmarked aircraft. Her sleeve was dark with blood. Dust covered her face. The rifle hung from one shoulder, its worn stock marked by fresh scratches from the ridge. She did not look like a legend. She looked tired. The two operators who had extracted her moved aside as Colonel Nathan Briggs approached from the command building. Every conversation on the flight line stopped. Briggs had spent 30 years in special operations. He was not known for ceremony, and he rarely offered public praise. But when he reached Claire, he stood at attention. Then he saluted her. The gesture spread silence across the entire base. Claire returned the salute. "Good to see you alive, Master Sergeant," Briggs said. "Good to be alive, sir." Blake looked toward Ethan. "Master Sergeant?" Ethan's eyes remained on Claire. "That is not the part you should be asking about." Briggs turned toward the assembled personnel. "Most of you know Master Sergeant Dawson as a reconnaissance specialist assigned to regional support." He paused. "That description is incomplete." Claire's expression tightened slightly. She did not enjoy speeches about herself. Briggs continued anyway. For 12 years, she served with a classified long-range interdiction unit. She trained coalition snipers, protected special operations teams, and completed missions that will never appear in official records. Mason glanced toward the old rifle. Briggs noticed. That weapon has been carried through 4 deployments. Today it kept 6. Navy SEALs alive. No one laughed. No one looked away. Ethan crossed the landing pad and stopped in front of Claire. "We should have listened." Claire studied him for a moment. "Yes." There was no anger in her voice. That made the word heavier. Ethan nodded. "We will next time." Claire looked past him toward the medical station. "How is Ruiz?" "Stable. Doctor says the round missed the artery." "Good." She began walking toward the armory. Blake followed. "Master Sergeant." Claire stopped, but did not turn. He stood several feet behind her, struggling to find the right words. That morning, apologies had seemed unnecessary to him. Now they seemed too small. "I mocked your rifle," he said. "I ignored your warning. And when the ambush started, I thought you had left us." Claire turned. Blake forced himself to meet her eyes. "I was wrong." The flight line remained quiet around them. Claire shifted the rifle strap on her shoulder. "You were." Blake lowered his head. "I'm sorry." She let the silence remain for several seconds. Then she stepped closer. "Confidence is useful," she said, "until it becomes louder than information." Blake nodded. Claire looked toward the mountains, now visible only as black shapes beneath the stars. "Out there, the terrain does not care about your pride. The enemy does not care about your record. And the bullet does not care who thinks they belong." Her eyes returned to him. "You listen. You learn. Or someone else pays for it." Blake swallowed. "Yes, Master Sergeant." Claire continued toward the armory. This time, Blake walked beside her instead of behind. Inside, she placed the rifle on the same maintenance table where he had mocked it hours earlier. The base was quieter now. No jokes. No careless voices. Only the soft sounds of Claire opening the bolt and removing the magazine. Blake stood across from her. "Can I help?" Claire looked at him. "Do you know how to clean a long-range rifle?" "No." She placed a cloth beside the weapon. "Then start by listening." Blake picked it up. Claire showed him how to check the chamber, inspect the optic mount, and remove the dust without damaging the mechanism. She explained each step once. He did not interrupt. Near midnight, Ethan entered the armory. He saw Blake working carefully while Claire watched. "Ruiz is awake," Ethan said. First thing he asked was whether the sniper made it back. Claire looked down at the rifle. "Tell him she did." Ethan nodded. Before leaving, he stopped at the door. "Claire." She looked up. "Thank you." Claire gave a small nod. That was all. The next morning, the team gathered for another briefing. When Claire entered the room, every SEAL stood. Not because Colonel Briggs had ordered it. Not because her classified record had been revealed. They stood because, on a mountain above a killing field, she had chosen their lives over her own safety. Blake pulled out the chair beside him. Claire sat down and opened her weathered notebook. No one questioned why she was there. No one laughed when she spoke. Respect had not been demanded. On that mountain, one shot at a time, it had been earned.